Most people don't realize their blood sugar is rising until it's already a problem. It doesn't start with anything dramatic, just small things. Fatigue after meals, cravings you can't quite explain, that slow, almost invisible shift in how your body responds to food. And when it finally gets noticed, the response is always the same: control it, manage it, take something for it. But here's the question that almost no one stops to ask: what if this isn't just about controlling something that went wrong? What if there was a time when people didn't wait for blood sugar to spike because the way they lived made that less likely in the first place? Not through extreme diets, not through complicated routines, but through simple, consistent things built into daily life. Because when you look closely at how people used to eat, grow, and prepare their food, a pattern starts to appear. Certain plants show up again and again, not randomly, not occasionally, but consistently, almost intentionally. And today, many of those same plants are still here, still growing, still accessible, just no longer part of the way most people think about health. So the question isn't just what helps lower blood sugar, it's what we quietly stopped using without ever realizing what we were losing. Now, this isn't one of those conversations where everything modern is bad and everything natural is better. That's not the point, because the truth is, modern medicine has its place. It's powerful, fast, and in many cases, necessary. But there's a quieter question that often gets overlooked: not what works today, but what existed before we needed to rely on it so heavily. Well, because there was a time when people didn't wait for something to go wrong before they responded. Their approach was different, slower, more consistent, built into daily life rather than used in moments of urgency. And when you start looking at what that life actually included, certain patterns begin to stand out. Not extreme solutions, not rare ingredients, just simple plants used repeatedly, intentionally, and over long periods of time. And that's where this starts to shift. Because this isn't really about choosing one system over another. It's about noticing what quietly disappeared and asking why. Because when you step back and really look at it, the difference isn't just what people used, it's when they used it. Today, most people respond to the body after something goes wrong. A spike, a symptom, auding a signal that something is off, and then comes the reaction. Something to bring it back down, something to manage what's already happening. But it wasn't always like that. There was a time when protection wasn't something you reached for in response. It was something you built into your life before anything had the chance to escalate. Not in complicated ways, not through strict routines, but through what was already part of daily living. The plants they grew, the herbs they added without thinking, the small, consistent things that supported the body quietly over time. And that's the shift most people don't notice. Because when something works slowly, consistently, almost invisibly, it doesn't feel like medicine. It feels ordinary, but that's exactly what made it powerful. A kind of system where you weren't chasing balance after losing it. You were maintaining it before it ever slipped away. And once you start seeing it that way, the question changes completely. Not just what helps lower blood sugar, but what was already helping long before we stopped paying attention. And when you start looking through that lens, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. It's not just one or two plants, it's a collection. Different in form, different in use, but connected by the same idea: supporting the body before things begin to break down. Some are probably already familiar, others might surprise you, but what they all have in common is how consistently they show up when you start tracing this pattern back. So instead of looking at them randomly, it helps to see them the way they were actually used: grouped, repeated. Weight key built into everyday life. And once you see that structure, the list starts to make a lot more sense. The first group is easy to overlook because they don't feel special. They're already in your kitchen: garlic. And this one is interesting because for something so common, it does more than most people realize. Used for centuries, not just for flavor, but because of how it interacts with the body. Compounds inside garlic don't just sit there, they respond, supporting insulin sensitivity, helping the body process sugar more efficiently instead of letting it linger where it shouldn't. And the way it's used isn't complicated. Crushed, left to sit for a moment, added to meals, or even taken raw in small amounts. But what makes it stand out isn't just what it does once, it's what it does consistently. Then there's onion, stronger, sharper, the kind of thing you notice immediately, but maybe not for the right reasons. And this one is interesting too, Because beyond the taste, it's been used for a long time in ways most people don't think about anymore. Onions contain compounds that support how the body responds to sugar, helping regulate spikes instead of letting them rise and fall unpredictably. It's not dramatic, not instant, but steady. And like garlic, the use is simple: cooked into meals, eaten raw in small amounts, part of something you're already doing without needing to change anything. But what makes it different is how quietly it supports balance over time. And then there's cumin, easier to miss, less noticeable. But this one works a little differently, because cumin doesn't just sit in the background, it helps the body process what it's given. Supporting digestion, which directly affects how sugar is absorbed, broken down, and managed. And that's something most people overlook, because blood sugar isn't just about what you eat, it's about how your body handles it afterward. Cumin has been used for centuries for exactly that reason. Added to food, warm, earthy, almost invisible unless it's missing. But once you start paying attention, you realize it's doing more than adding flavor. It's helping the system work the way it's supposed to. And that's the pattern that starts to emerge here. These aren't rare plants, they're not difficult to find, they're already part of everyday life, which makes the real question harder to ignore. If something this simple has always been here, why did we stop seeing it as something that actually supports the body? Wait, and this is where the pattern starts to shift slightly, because the next group isn't just part of everyday meals, it's more intentional: cinnamon. And this one stands out almost immediately, because unlike the others, it's already being talked about again, but not always understood. Cinnamon has been used for a long time, not just for taste, but for how it interacts with blood sugar itself, helping improve insulin sensitivity, slowing the way sugar enters the bloodstream, making those sharp spikes feel less dramatic. And the use is simple: added to tea, mixed into warm water, sprinkled into food. Nothing complicated, but what makes it different is how directly it supports balance, not just indirectly through digestion. Then there's mint, lighter, cooling, easy to overlook, but this one works in a quieter way. Because mint helps calm the system, supporting digestion, reducing internal stress, which plays a bigger role in blood sugar than most people realize. Because when the body is under constant stress, regulation becomes harder, and mint helps soften that. Used as tea, fresh leaves steeped in hot water, something simple but consistent. And then coriander. This one is easy to miss, often seen as just a spice, something added without much thought. But coriander has been used for centuries to support how the body processes sugar, helping reduce imbalances and support more stable levels over time. Again, nothing extreme, just added into meals, used regularly, built into daily life. And that's what keeps showing up here. Not intensity, not quick fixes, but small, consistent support repeated over time. Which makes you start to wonder, if these herbs were always part of the system, why do they feel like extras now instead of essentials? And this is where things start to feel a little different, because not everything that supports the body feels easy at first. Some of the most effective plants in this pattern share one thing in common: they're bitter, bitter melon. And this one is interesting because it doesn't try to hide what it is. Sharp, intense, not something you reach for casually, but inside the body, it does something very specific, helping lower blood sugar levels by supporting how glucose is used rather than letting it remain circulating where it can cause damage. It's often prepared as a tea or lightly cooked, not for comfort, but for effect. Then there's fenugreek. It slightly nutty, but still carrying that underlying bitterness. And this one works in a more gradual way, helping slow down how carbohydrates are absorbed, supporting more stable blood sugar instead of sudden spikes and drops. Usually soaked, sometimes added to meals, simple but consistent. And then dandelion. This one surprises most people because it's often dismissed as nothing more than a weed. But dandelion has been used for a long time to support liver function, which plays a direct role in how the body regulates blood sugar, helping process, filter, and balance what moves through the system. Used as tea, leaves, roots. Nothing exotic, just overlooked. And that's the pattern that becomes harder to ignore here. These aren't plants people stopped using because they didn't work. Anaki, they're plants people moved away from because they weren't easy, because they required intention, because they didn't fit into a system built around quick results. And once you see that, something shifts, because it's no longer just about what works. It's about what we've been avoiding. And then there's another group, not just bitter, not just supportive, but familiar in a completely different way, because these aren't hidden. They're not rare. They've been here the whole time, just seen differently, not as medicine, but as something ordinary. And that might be the most surprising part of all, because when something powerful becomes familiar, it stops being questioned. It just becomes part of the background until you start looking closer and realize it was never just what you thought it was. Because once you start looking closer, the pattern shifts again, not toward things that are hidden, but toward things that were never hidden at all. Aloe. And this one is interesting because most people think they already understand it. Something you keep by a window, something you reach for when the skin is irritated. But inside the body, aloe works differently, supporting how glucose is absorbed, helping reduce sudden spikes, calming internal inflammation that often goes unnoticed. And the way it's used isn't complicated. A small amount, fresh gel, sometimes blended, sometimes taken carefully on its own. Simple but intentional. Then there's olive, and this one feels even more familiar because it's everywhere, in kitchens, in meals, used daily without much thought. But olive, especially in its pure form, has been connected for a long time to how the body supports heart function, and more importantly, how it handles sugar and circulation together, helping improve insulin response, supporting blood vessels, creating a kind of internal stability that most people don't immediately connect to what they're eating. Used as oil, added to food, nothing extreme, just consistent. And then fig. This one surprises people because it doesn't look like something that would belong in this conversation at all. But fig leaves in particular have been used to support blood sugar regulation, helping the body respond more efficiently rather than reactively. Often prepared as tea, sometimes dried, sometimes fresh. Again, nothing complicated, just overlooked. Then there's mustard, small, almost easy to ignore. But when used properly, mustard seeds stimulate the body, supporting metabolism, encouraging movement internally instead of stagnation. And that matters more than most people think, because when the body slows down, imbalance tends to follow. Used in small amounts, ground, added to meals, subtle but effective. And finally, hyssop. This one carries a different kind of weight, less familiar, less talked about, but used historically for cleansing, not just externally, but internally, supporting balance, supporting the body's ability to reset, to regulate, to maintain stability where things would otherwise drift, usually prepared as tea. Simple, but deliberate. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because these aren't rare plants. They're not difficult to find. They've been here the entire time. But somewhere along the way, they stopped being seen as something that supports the body and started being treated as something ordinary. And maybe that's the most important shift of all, because when something powerful becomes familiar, it disappears in plain sight. And this is where it gets interesting, because up until now, you might still be thinking, these are just supportive. Helpful maybe, but not necessarily powerful. But one of these was once treated very differently, not as something ordinary, but as something valuable. And that changes how you see everything that came before it. Because when you start looking at the next few plants, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. Ginger. And this one is interesting because it doesn't work quietly. It moves. On warming the body, stimulating circulation, helping the system process sugar more efficiently instead of letting it settle and build. And that matters because when movement slows, imbalance tends to follow. Used fresh, boiled into tea, added into meals, simple but active. Then there's turmeric. And this one feels familiar, but often misunderstood because turmeric isn't just about inflammation, it works deeper than that. Helping improve insulin response, supporting how the body handles glucose over time, reducing the internal resistance that makes regulation harder, usually combined with black pepper, warm, earthy, something that builds effect through consistency, not intensity. And then the vine, the grapevine. This one carries a different kind of weight because it's not just about the fruit, it's about what's inside it. But compounds like resveratrol, now studied for how they support blood vessels, circulation, and the systems that directly affect how sugar moves through the body. And suddenly, something that once felt symbolic starts to look very physical, very real, very connected. But even then, there's one that stands apart. And this is where everything shifts, because this one wasn't just used, it was valued, measured, traded. Saffron, thin threads, light, almost fragile, but once worth its weight in gold. And not for decoration, for effect, because saffron interacts with the body in ways that go beyond what most people expect, supporting metabolism, influencing how the body manages sugar, even affecting mood and internal balance. And suddenly, that value doesn't feel exaggerated anymore. It feels earned. And that's the moment everything comes together. All because none of these plants were random. None of them were accidental. They were part of a system, a way of supporting the body before things began to break down. Quietly, consistently, without needing to wait for something to go wrong first. And even beyond the ones we've talked about, there are a few more that quietly complete the picture. Basil. And this one is easy to underestimate because it feels light, fresh, almost decorative. But basil supports how the body responds to stress. And that matters more than most people realize, because stress and blood sugar are more connected than they seem. Used fresh, added to meals, simple but consistent. Then there's parsley, often pushed to the side, treated like garnish, but parsley supports kidney function, helping the body manage fluid balance and remove what doesn't belong. Keto, and that directly affects how the body maintains stability internally. Again, nothing complicated, just overlooked. And then thyme, small, subtle, almost invisible unless you're paying attention. But thyme carries compounds that support the body's internal defense systems, helping maintain balance where disruption often begins quietly. Used as tea, added to food, simple but purposeful. And when you step back and look at all of this together, it becomes harder to see these as random ingredients. They start to look like something else entirely. So maybe the question isn't just which of these plants help, it's why so many of them quietly faded out of the way we think about health in the first place. Because when you look at everything together, the patterns, the repetition, the consistency, it doesn't feel random. It feels intentional. A way of living where support wasn't something you reached for after something went wrong. It was something built into daily life, long before anything had the chance to. And maybe that's what feels so unfamiliar now. Not the plants themselves, but the idea of staying connected to something simple, something consistent, something that works quietly in the background. Because in a world that moves fast, reacts quickly, and looks for immediate results, it's easy to overlook what works slowly until you start paying attention again. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee, because now it's not just information anymore, it's a choice. What you keep in your kitchen, what you grow, what you return to day after day without needing to wait for a problem to begin. And if even one of these stood out to you, then you're already noticing something most people move past. So stay with that. Stay curious, because this isn't really about going backward. It's about reconnecting with something that was always there. And once you start seeing it this way, you don't look at health the same again.